Well, one of the things when you read the Gospels that you see is that Jesus prays often. Jesus prays all the time. He often removes himself from the crowds, and he just kind of wanders off by himself, and he goes to pray. Which is funny, because in the crowd and the disciples, they go kind of nuts, because they can't find Jesus, and they want to find him. But he prays. He goes off by himself. And he prays before major decisions. He prays before picking the disciples. He prays before going to Jerusalem. He prays before being arrested. He prays on the cross. But his prayers, Jesus' prayers, weren't always solo prayers. They weren't always just private whispers that he spoke in silence as part of his own spiritual life. Jesus also prays for people. He prays for the people who are blind. He prays for those who are lame and those who have died, and they are raised. So often we take a look at Jesus and we emphasize how much of a strong teacher he was and how his teachings and his lessons continued on in the lives of the disciples. But a large part of Jesus' ministry was a ministry of prayer. And that ministry also carries on in the lives of the disciples. The disciples, they pray. They pray a lot. They pray by themselves. They pray through their letters. They pray in prisons. And they pray for people. We saw that in our reading from Acts today. Peter goes to Joppa, where a disciple named Tabitha has died. And what does he do? He prays. And she comes back to life. But the point of that reading is not that Peter is really good at praying. That, he's a super prayer, or he has this divine gift upon him. The point is that through the prayers of the disciples, Jesus is still at work. Even though Jesus has died and rise, and at this point he has ascended into heaven and Pentecost has happened and all this kind of stuff, Jesus is still at work. Prayer and praying for people is one of the ways that the disciples are invited to join into the work that Jesus is doing in the world. And that's the challenge for us. Not just to be a body of prayer, not just to be a congregation of prayer, but to be people who see that through our prayers, Jesus is still at work. So I invite you to pick up your pew Bibles and turn to the book of Acts, chapter 9. Acts is the fifth book of the New Testament, so in the second half of the Bible. The passage that Julie read, the first reading, it seems fairly simple. Tabitha, who was a beloved leader of the Christian community in Joppa, she gets sick and she dies. And clearly she was an important person. And that's evidenced by the fact that her room is filled with the widows who are weeping and mourning for her passing. And when Peter comes in, they show Peter all the work that she did, all the stuff that she made in support of them. In fact, Tabitha, this reading, is the only time in the New Testament that the word for disciple is feminized and given to a woman. It's Tabitha. So Tabitha is clearly an important leader, an important figure in the Christian community in Joppa. And so when the people in the community, when they learn that Peter is just nearby, kind of akin to Calgary and Airdrie, he's just kind of down the road, well, they go to him and they urge him, please come at once, come to Joppa. Peter comes. He prays. And he presents Tabitha back to the community. She comes back to life, and he presents her back. Everything is fairly straightforward. Until you realize that this event mirrors another one. In the Gospel of Mark, we hear about Jesus healing a little girl whose father is named Jairus. And Jairus comes to Jesus and says, my little girl is sick. Please come to my house. And Jesus, by the time he gets there, the little girl has died, and the house is filled with people who are weeping and mourning over the death of this little girl. Jesus comes and he kicks everybody out, and he goes in alone. And he prays, little girl, get up. And she does. And he gives her back to her parents. Do you notice the similarities? Both Jesus and Peter are beckoned by people pleading with them to come to the house. Both involve someone who has died. Both houses are filled with people who are mourning. Jesus kicks everybody out. In verse 40, Peter kicks everybody out. Jesus says, little girl, get up, which in Aramaic is talitha kum. Talitha kum, little girl, get up. Peter prays, Tabitha, get up, which in Aramaic is Tabitha kum. It's one letter difference. Jesus takes the little girl by the hand. In verse 41, Peter takes her by the hand and helps her to her feet. The two events stand side by side, and they mirror each other. And it's not an accident. Nor is Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, just kind of confused as to who did what. And he's not conflating two stories. The point that is being made for everybody to see is that Jesus is still working. That the healing power of Jesus is still at work. Jesus acted for Tabitha in the very same way that he acted for Jairus' daughter, except this time he used the prayers of Peter. Jesus is at work in the world. He might not be walking around in robes and Birkenstocks, but he's still alive. And Jesus is still active. And the exciting thing in all of this is that the disciples are invited to join in his work. And one of the ways that they do that is through their prayers. The exciting thing for us, who live in that great line, who see ourselves as disciples and as followers of Jesus, is that we are invited to join in Jesus' work in the world. And the way we do that is through our prayers. Sometimes we talk about prayer, don't we? We talk about it in terms of the importance of having a prayer life or of cultivating that activity. We talk about it in means of bringing our burdens and our cares before God. And that's an important part of our spiritual life. And when we talk about that, individuals may feel a little challenged to think, well, yeah, I probably need to pray a bit more. Or, praying, having a prayer life is probably a little bit more than just saying grace at dinner, so I probably need to cultivate something. But even in that challenge, it's fairly comfortable, isn't it? Because prayers are silent, and they're internal. We don't have to step outside of ourselves. We don't have to be vocal or apparent. People around us don't really need to know what we're doing. And that's okay. Those private and those inner prayers are important, and they build that solid foundation by which we live our Christian life. And those silent prayers, those internal prayers, can be just as powerful as anything else. And yet there are times where we are called to pray differently. There are times where we are called to be vocal, where Jesus wants to do a visual work through us. When the people came to Peter in Lydda and said, please come to Joppa, come to the house, Peter could have easily said, all right, well, Tabitha's on my prayer list, and I will pray, and just, tell me how it goes. And I'm sure in many places he probably did that. He probably said, I'm praying for these people, I'm praying for this community, and he probably had his own list of people that he prayed for. But here he didn't. Because the work of Jesus in that situation was to be different. And we see in verse 42, we hear the news of Tabitha became known over all of Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. Sometimes we're called to be a little bit more bold. I believe I told you the story of when I was in university and walking with a friend of mine who, at that point, was not a Christian. At this point, he's still not a Christian, but he wants to be. He just doesn't know that yet. We were walking, and he said, can you pray for me? Just kind of out of the blue. And I was taken aback. Like, I'd been praying for this for a long time. And so I prayed in my mind that, God would touch him and lead him, and I forget exactly what I prayed. And we kept on walking, and he said, so will you pray for me? Like, hello, big neon sign saying, do something here. But I was scared. So I said, I just did. And we kept on walking. And that was it. Now, God can use olive prayers. God can use silent prayers, and I think God can use that situation. But part of me wonders, what dynamic didn't happen because I wasn't as bold as I could have been? That I didn't kind of say, okay, well, let's go over here and actually vocally pray. What might have Jesus